In Chapter 23, we're going to look at potential GDP and the natural unemployment rate a bit more completely. So, if you recall that when an economy is at its full employment level, the cyclical unemployment level is equal to 0. The economy is fully charged, and therefore its real GDP level is equal to that of its potential GDP. There are periods of time when the economy slows down, then we're below our potential, and other times when the economy is supercharged, superheated, our real GDP can be above our potential GDP. If we look at the short run, if you recall, in the short run, the factors of production are largely fixed. So the amount of capital, machinery, equipment, land, entrepreneurship, and the state of technology at any given point at any specific time are all fixed. The only thing that can be varied is the quantity of employment. So decisions that businesses and individuals make about employment, that is what's going to affect our real GDP. So real GDP, how much we produce, depends largely in the short run on the quantity of labor employed. There is a new graph called a production function that we're going to look at. It is not the same as the production possibility frontier of the production possibility curve, which had this shape. So we're not looking at that between two different goods and the trade-offs. So just crossing that off. The production function is looking at what's the maximum quantity real GDP that can be produced with a certain amount of workers. So if you think about the graph, this is in the short run. Well, if we have 0 workers, the assumption is we're going to have no production. In the macro sense, it's going to be as the quantity of labor is increased, we can have increasing levels of real GDP, and of course it does start flattening out. So this is a production function. It's a relationship on the x-axis between the quantity of labor, number of people employed, and how much output our real GDP is. I just wrote this not to confuse function notation, but if you think about, as we do with functions, inputs and outputs, so what is real GDP depend upon? Well, real GDP, think of it as a function. It's a function of labor, capital, and technology. Once again, in the short run, we're going to say labor is what can be varied, and the others are fixed. So in this scenario, just reading off the graph of this production function from the top, if there are 200 billion hours of labor that are being utilized, they are being used fully, then what is our output? As you can see, just reading off the graph, it would be $10 trillion of real GDP. If we had more workers, or more workers working more hours, in either case, there are more total hours. If there are 300 billion hours, then if that was the case, our real GDP would be somewhere in the middle, maybe a little bit below the midpoint, say 12 trillion. So you can think of this as a boundary, the production frontier. On it is attainable. Above it, out here, these points are not attainable. And of course, below the curve is attainable, but resources not fully used effectively. So somewhat similar in that context of inside or outside the production possibility curve from before. Let's review our prior topic, diminishing returns to labor. This is in the short run with fixed capital. So as more and more workers are being added, there's a tendency that as you add the next worker, they produce fewer and fewer output than the worker before. So if I add a fourth worker, if he produces 6 goods, The next worker, the fifth worker, may only produce 4 goods. So as the quantity of labor increases, the marginal product of labor decreases. And as a formula, the marginal product of labor is the change in output over the change in labor. Represents how much additional output can we produce when we add one more worker. In a labor market different than the product market, the question is who demands labor? Well, once again, this is not a product market, it is a labor market. So the businesses, the firms are the ones who demand labor. They hire workers. Who supplies labor? Individuals, alternative term, households, are the ones who supply the labor. So if you can read the sentence that follows, and if you can draw a labor market with those numbers, you can put it on pause. So since it's a labor market, we know we have the typical supply and demand for labor. On our y-axis, we have real wage. On our x-axis, we have quantity of employment, and this unit, though, is in billions of hours. So it's just a sum total of the hours being worked. Some people work 40 hours, some people work 60. And in this equilibrium, this model, the wage rate is $30 an hour, and they assumed full employment, which was 200 billion hours of labor. So in this scenario, full employment, so the natural unemployment rate as well, let's say around 4 or 5%. Cyclical employment is 0 by definition. So the labor market, of course, we know determines the wage rate. It also determines how many people are being employed. Even though it's in hours, we could translate it to people. And it also, we'll see, determines potential GDP. So in this example, the full employment level is when the cyclical unemployment level is 0, and that occurs when the labor supply equals the labor demand. So since we assumed full employment, we're going to take this 200 billion hours, and we're now going to go to the production function, and we can find out the level of potential GDP. So remember that number 200, if you go to the page. So from our labor supply to labor demand graph, we saw the 200 billion hours. And even though our axis is real GDP of 10 trillion, it's also our potential GDP. Because in the labor supply, labor demand market, when we're in equilibrium, we're assuming full employment. Later on, we can look when we're below or above that level. But at full employment, cyclical unemployment is 0, and therefore our real GDP is equal to our potential GDP. And you can read the top, so that's what I just did. From the LSLD, labor supply, labor demand curve, we get a full employment quantity of labor. We take that value, which was the 200 billion. We go across to the y-axis, and we can read off the real GDP, which is the same as our potential GDP. So now, looking back at the natural unemployment rate. Well, the natural employment rate, by definition, is when we're at our full employment level. That's when cyclical unemployment level is equal to 0. So we know there are 4 reasons for unemployment. Well, if there is no cyclical unemployment, if the economy is fully charged, We know there are three others. Well, seasonal comes and go. You can't really affect the seasons, but we're going to look at the other two. So there's structural unemployment, and there's also frictional unemployment. And there's frictional. So if the unemployment rate, if we have cyclical unemployment of 0, if the unemployment rate is 4 or 5% in full employment, what are the reasons for that structural and frictional unemployment? And it's two key factors that affect it. One is the job search. So it's how much time do people spend looking, who are unemployed, who are looking for an acceptable job? Let me go to the big factor, unemployment benefits. Different nations and different states have varying amounts of unemployment benefits, both by length of time and also by payment. So think of someone who gets frictional employment, lets go, or quits, or someone who's laid off structural employment. They're looking for a job. They're looking for an acceptable job to take the job. Well, the amount of unemployment benefits is going to affect how long they're looking. So think if you're at a nation that has extremely generous unemployment benefits. Say the period of time is 1 year. Let's say the payment is 90% of the person's salary. Well, that would be extremely generous, both length of time and payment. Contrast that to someone who gets 6 weeks and gets 50% of their pay. Well, who's going to be searching longer for a new job? Hopefully it's obvious. The person who gets really, really great benefits, longer benefits, and higher amount, that person is doing pretty well, so they're going to sit back and keep looking for the job. So that would increase their job search. If the unemployments weren't quite so generous, so certainly compared to the 6 weeks and 50% of the pay, that person is more likely to accept some other job sooner because their benefits are going to run out and aren't going to be so good. Of course, structural changes, how fast robots are replacing workers, maybe the internet changes, demographic changes, could be the baby boomers or two-income households. Really not too important. Just broadly, you should know job search affects how much time people are looking for jobs due to frictional or structural unemployment. And the second one is also explained by job rationing. Here, there are not enough jobs due to external forces or rules. So, sometimes people actually make their real wage is above what would normally be their salary through the regular forces of supply and demand in the labor market. So if we look at these three reasons, probably an easy one for you to recognize first is minimum wage. We know by definition, if minimum wage is effective, people are paid above the actual wage. Well, anytime you're paid above the real wage, then that's going to decrease the quantity of labor demanded. Businesses are going to hire less workers. Of course, individuals are willing to work. They're going to supply more labor. So this is going to lead to too many workers, which is going to result in higher unemployment. So minimum wage create a salary above the real wage that the market forces would have had, and therefore there's going to be a surplus of labor, and that's going to cause an increase in unemployment. Hence, I will explain some of the reasons why people are still looking for work, even if the economy is fully charged. Another reason for this is called an efficiency wage. Some businesses on their own just pay the workers above what is required to pay. They could do it as incentive for workers to work harder. Also, another reason is retraining. If businesses spend quite a bit of time and effort in training workers, if those workers leave, they have to get another worker, train them again, it costs them more money. So sometimes they'll pay them above what typically they would need to pay them. And of course, unions, the purpose of unions is to get more pay and benefits. The process of collective bargaining is actually going before the Supreme Court right now, because some union workers are forced to give some of their salary to the unions. But if union workers get more money than normally would, of course, there'll be less people employed and higher unemployment. And that is chapter 23. I would want you to do the page that follows, the classical difference Keynesian. No, that's not in this video. I mentioned in class, I asked you to read a page about it and pull out the bullet points for these, and then fill out the rest of the page as the review.